On this week's Carrier Wrap, we speak with Allianz Science and Technology to discuss wireless spectrum challenges for the telecom space, including the ongoing 600 megahertz incentive auction and government plans to free up higher band spectrum resources. Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. And this week we are joined again by Carl Nebbia, who's the Director of Spectrum Solutions at Allianz Science and Technology, talking a bit about the current spectrum environment. So, hey, Carl, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it.
And thanks for inviting me back.
Great, appreciate it. And again, I should also mention too that Carl was also the former head of the NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management as well. So a long history in terms of spectrum policy and spectrum solutions. So hey, Carl, again, like I said, thanks for joining us this week. Appreciate it. So maybe we'll start off with, I think the last time we talked was back in January, and since then, the government has moved with its 600 megahertz incentive auction. We are now, I guess, into it to an extent. I think we're still waiting for the reverse auction part to complete, and then there'll be the repackaging and then the forward. So we still have a ways to go, but there's been at least some movement. I know the administration came out recently and said that they've are going to clear up to 126 megahertz of spectrum, which was, I don't know if it's a big surprise or not, but I guess what's your general view of how the whole process has, I guess, gone from its initiation back in, I guess, late March now to where we are today?
Yeah. Once again, I think the 126 megahertz that they're talking about represents a sense that they believe things are going well and they're going to have a successful outcome. And I have to obviously take them at their word that that's what they think the outcome will be. I think there are probably others who are less optimistic, but I still think we're dealing with a process, of course, that's never been done before, certainly not in the spectrum world. And a lot of people are watching this effort. And I think it's moving along according to the course set out by the commission. So we'll see what the outcome is. I think certainly whether you think a specific number is what represents a positive outcome, I think the thing that I think everybody needs to take into consideration is that there needs to be a sufficiently positive outcome, I think, to continue the momentum and continue the idea that the wireless industry really wants spectrum. And there's a lot of people out there, of course, waiting to see whether these folks are serious or not. They want to know whether the AWS-3, $40 billion was an aberration, a one-time thing, or whether the emphasis continues. Certainly, the wireless industry has said that it's going to continue, and their expectation is that they need more spectrum. They're continuing to keep the pressure on. They've put up work with Congress on more legislation to try to move that process along. But I still think what happens here sends an essential message. If it comes out in a way that provides significant spectrum, then maybe it sends that message that, yes, the heat is still on, the need is still there. I think from a specific number standpoint, the reality is they've got to get at least 50, because in NTIA...
$50 billion?
50 megahertz.
Oh, 50 megahertz, okay. Okay, so let me get the right number.
Excuse me, yeah. They have to get at least 50 megahertz out of it, because NTIA and the FCC working together have 255, I think, left to go to hit the magic 500 megahertz number. And NTIA only has certain bands left on the table that can be that stand any chance of meeting that 2020 goal. So I think once again, if you do, if for instance less than 50 fell out, there's no way that NTIA and the FCC together can accomplish the rest of the spectrum needed to meet that 500 goal. If it goes above 50, you start cutting into that. But I still think an essential point out of that is the vast majority of what's left actually has to be made out of the 2 5 gigahertz bands that have been put on the table. They are 120 megahertz in one case and 70, 75 in the other. So they're where the spectrum is of what's left. The other two small pieces don't account for enough to make it happen, which of course raises the question, are they going to solve those 5 gigahertz issues by the time this administration leaves? And I think they will do everything they can to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, like you said, this is a very complex auction process, the one going on right now. And I think we talked about that on our last conversation, just the complexity involved and how it is kind of setting the stage for what might be future spectrum auctions going forward, because it is getting more and more difficult to find spectrum that's of use to the commercial side of the cellular industry. So that's a big part of that. And like you said, too, so I mean, obviously the 126 megahertz was a nice number for the FCC to kind of come out with and announce. But I mean, I guess, do you think that that's a reasonable goal, or are you expecting that to be kind of maybe a high watermark that we probably might not hit that, but if we get 100 megahertz, I mean, what do you think is being a reasonable number?
I think you gave the perfect answer. I mean, it's clearly it is the high end, I think, and we'll have to see what comes there. If we come up with 120 megahertz, for instance, then maybe it means in the 5850 to 5925, you don't have to designate the whole band for Wi-Fi, that you can in fact allow the auto industry to hold on to a piece. And obviously some of the proposals say, yeah, move all those safety uses up to the top end and so on. So maybe that approach, fits in to the commission's goals. But once again, I think the really exciting thing is not only do we see the politics of the next election working out in the daily press, but we know that it's going to force some decisions to be made come before January. So.
Yeah, exactly. I know that's one thing about the ongoing process as well, is that I think many were hoping that it could be completed before the November timeframe, just to kind of stay out of the whole election process. It seems like, that might not be the case depending on how much spectrum actually is put up and the repackaging efforts. So yeah, it does seem like there is that kind of timeline there of kind of the concurrent political issues going on as well, which will make kind of what happens, it seems like, over the next couple of months interesting in terms of what the FCC does. But I guess before we get off the auction process there, I mean, I guess in general, do you think that the FCC, as we led up to the auction itself, did they lay out, you think, sufficient rules and guidelines to, I guess, make the process as easy as possible?
Well, I mean, I think you can always question. I think they've done a terrific job for a first time around getting this moving. And I know, having attended the World Radio Conference back in November, there's a lot of people around the world wondering how this is going to work out. In fact, I'm sure some things would have gone better at that conference had this already had occurred. Yeah. And we could have gone to the conference saying, see, we've made this work. It produces funds. It makes a way for mobile to get in these bands. But at this point, that's past news. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, interesting. Well, again, you also kind of bring up some of the other spectrum that is being looked at in terms of, again, meeting that goal that the current administration laid out 6-7 years ago now, whenever it was, to hit that 500 megahertz. You mentioned the 5 gig bands as well. Does it seem like that there is, I guess, progress being made there, or is that kind of like what you said earlier, is that kind of being hinged upon what happens in terms of 600 megahertz? How much is freed up there? Do you think there's going to have to be some more effort in the 5 band?
Well, I think more effort is certainly going to be required because they haven't resolved the issue, and I think at least my sense, having grown up in a family with 2 brothers and a sister, last thing you want to do is present to your parents an unresolved issue that they're just going to make the decision and force it. And you never come out with as good an outcome as if you had actually worked together and come up with that. So we hope at this point that there's certainly enough dialogue going on between the Wi-Fi industry and the auto industry to try to resolve things. Certainly everybody has to have some leverage there in order to feel like their point of view is going to win or lose, and they'll work that. I think the struggle on the auto side is it has been 15 years or something since the SRC spectrum was set aside. I mean, it's been a long time, and sooner or later they have to come up with an outcome. And in this case, the vehicle-to-vehicle capabilities they're looking for, of course, if you buy the system, you have to have other vehicles out there doing it too. Otherwise you're talking to yourself. So it's going to have to require some fairly rapid growth and cooperation for it to take in the industry. The 5350, 5470 deals with very different issues. We've got international satellite sensors in that band. Some of them operated by friends of ours. The Canadians own one of the satellites, Europeans own another one, and they of course don't want that interfered with. All those types of measurements support evaluation on global warming and all those things. So it certainly has a very important role. We've also got military radar systems in there of various sorts, and so we've got to resolve these issues, I think, to move it forward. So we'll see what happens between here and January, and how interested everybody is in sharing. Which, once again, another family value.
We'll get this, yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah, we'll get to sharing here in a minute as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess before we get off the 5 gigahertz part, it does seem like that a lot of times we kind of forget that there is this international component when it comes to working with spectrum bands. I mean, ideally, you don't want to have a worldwide, band plan if you could. It rarely happens just because of various issues. But that is a big part of this. You have to kind of take into account that there are even our close neighbors, but international countries as well. There's always that challenge of trying to get international support for a lot of these band plans as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the motivations there change over the years, because the U.S. was traditionally in a position of saying, first of all, any kind of unlicensed use that we want to do is essentially nobody else's business. It's not an ITU matter, it's a domestic matter. And when the first discussion of 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi came up, whatever it was, 10 years ago or so, the U.S. initially took the position as this was not a WRC issue, and it didn't require allocations, didn't require anything. But the Europeans were particularly interested in it. Certainly our Defense Department, which had concerns about it, thought, well, an internationally agreed outcome would be better for us than having something that we're doing in the U.S. that works, but we can't live with what they do elsewhere. So in the end, the U.S. opted to play the game and to work along with it. Now, many years later, it's the U.S. pushing this work in the ITU, even though ultimately in the U.S. it's going to result in unlicensed uses, not licensed uses. And we see the rest of the world objecting to, do this. So it's funny how the tables turn, and you almost find that no argument is necessarily the same argument you're going to make at the next conference. In fact, it may be just the opposite argument. So
that's true. Yeah, if you have an argument that you're going to use, always keep it on the table for maybe you have to bring it out at a later date as well. So you never know what's going to happen out there. So,
but it is an international process, and I know with the Canadians, the Canadian government, who we work very closely with, actually owns the Canadian satellite. So they have a very clear identity with that. U.S. federal agencies use that data. It's important to them, even though we're not flying one of those satellites. So anyway, a lot of things tied together.
Yeah, it's all kind of working together. But again, now I guess maybe then moving up the spectrum bands a bit. I know there's been a lot of talk recently about the use of millimeter wave spectrum, centimeter wave, millimeter wave, anything above the 20 gig, well, 18 gig really, and higher bands as well. It seems like there is some progress being made there. It seems like some operators are already moving forward with using spectrum that they already own in some of those bands for trialing of various technologies as well. I guess as you look at kind of those higher band spectrum, issues there, I guess it's always a challenge of those bands not being very, propagation characteristics and things like that are always a challenge there. I guess how useful can those bands be to the commercial side of things? I mean, these bands haven't been used for a reason, I think, and it's because they're just very difficult to work with, it would seem, in a commercial setting. I guess what's your view on the usefulness and I guess how operators might actually tap into those bands at a future date?
Well, at least from my standpoint, coming from a spectrum management background, a regulator's background, first of all, I see the spectrum manager's role, the regulator's role as providing the opportunity. The technologists then and the service providers and so on have to follow through to make it happen. I was involved in WRC 97 when they debated what they then called the V-band, trying to divide it up between fixed wireless access and high-density fixed satellite service. And it was a really difficult issue where there were companies on both sides. The U.S. had a hard time deciding what it wanted to do, other than it wanted to ensure that the satellite industry had a long-term future and an opportunity, and it didn't want the international community to close that out. So we, in the end, fought very hard. We were successful in getting an acceptance of the fixed satellite high-density capability. Now, all these years later, almost 20 years later, those systems never been implemented. So we made the opportunity, we gave them the chance, they didn't happen. Maybe this next round is when they will happen, and we'll see how that goes. I did have a chance to attend the TIA conference that went on in Dallas the last few days. I just got back from that, and the fascinating thing was, I mean, there were technology people there talking about the latest glorious things that they were creating. Some people were talking about things like, I think it was holographic beamforming, you know, which sounds like real Star Trek type stuff, you know, a lot of new capabilities that make it work. We saw a lot of energy, even from service providers saying, yes, this is the next big thing. Then on Tuesday, I attended a panel that was capital markets people, you know, folks that were going to have to get behind this effort with money to make it happen. And I was very surprised that the panel essentially said, no, the wireless companies are too heavily debt loaded as it is. The infrastructure build out is just, you know, way over the top. Even people talking about, obviously, when you create high bandwidth wireless systems, you've got to get that signal back to some place where it gets into the wired line and so on. And there were people there talking about how it was going to be difficult even to produce enough fiber optic cable to run all this stuff in the time that these people were talking about. I still see that as an issue of if the demand is there, somebody's going to produce the cable, whether that means they're going to crank up new plants, new production facilities, and so on. They're going to make it happen. But I still think ultimately there is certain questions about whether the capital investment that's required is going to be able to support what profits come in through this capability. And they did show how while the bandwidth has gone up significantly in the wireless world over the past few years, the actual profit share has not increased so much. So essentially, they're producing all kinds of great new things just to keep going. So I think that's interesting. So for me, I think it sets up a situation where what you might see happen is a little bit like what we've seen in the Wi-Fi world, where you have people who have a location-based interest that begin to say, well, we have a tremendous need here for more bandwidth, and we would like to have the infrastructure on our site to make that happen. And a good example, at least from my experience, is years ago when we went to the ITU for radio conferences, everything was done with paper. And at some point, the ITU decided we need to do Wi-Fi. We're going to make that happen. And the first couple conferences I went to, it was like so slow that you couldn't get your document downloaded. They had taken your paper away from you, and then you were stuck in this place in between. Then the ITU came back and said, well, this isn't going to work for 2,500 delegates, for hundreds of documents and so on. They upgraded their Wi-Fi capability, and now you go to these huge conferences, everybody's working wirelessly, and none of it was based on having to go get Swisscom to come out and improve their wireless network. It was all done through Wi-Fi capability and so on. So I think you may see, whether it's apartment complexes or stadiums or companies wanting that increased bandwidth, being willing to foot the bill on the infrastructure within their facility. And then I think it becomes more of a question of, can you start connecting those things facility to facility in the true mesh network concept that I think people envisioned years ago. I mean, already when you go to an airport, when you go to the mall, when you go, hotel, you expect to be able to crank your Wi-Fi up and it goes on to their network. And if you're willing to live with whatever security issues you may have doing that, I mean, I know when I go to the airport, it's great to be able to sit down, link to the airport Wi-Fi, and you just continue on your way. You don't have to, have cellular service yourself and so on. So maybe in this 5G world, we finally get to the point where that mesh networking becomes possible and you float from location to location, and where the service is, it is, and where it isn't, you have to come up with some other approach. It's just a little bit difficult, believe, certainly based on the capital oriented people, that the money for the infrastructure build is going to be there. Certainly, in the next few years, it's going to be tough to see that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I would definitely recommend anybody who goes to these various shows that if you do have a capital or a investors panel, to definitely check them out, because you do get some interesting angles on these great ideas. I mean, obviously, like you said, the technology people are always working, moving, pushing things ahead with great ideas. But then you talk to the financial guys, and they seem to kind of be not a buzzkill, but they a little reality check from those guys at times to what's actually possible. I mean, I know, going to shows in the past, and even them discussing the 2.5 band that Sprint's using, for instance, the issues just with that alone and costs involved. I think we're seeing that kind of play out in the commercial space. But you're right. As you move up the bands, the costs associated with it is a bit of a challenge right now. And again, maybe if we get to a point where we're so starved for spectrum, the cost benefit makes itself more available. But until we get there, you're right. It does seem like we're probably a ways away from just using every band out there, because there are so many issues in terms of coverage.
That's right. And maybe you come out with approaches, maybe the high density fixed satellite capability actually comes along. You don't have all the infrastructure and so on. But somebody was talking to me earlier and said, well, certain people are advocating this wireless as it avoids a lot of the infrastructure, but you have short link wireless systems still have to get connected in somewhere, or once again, you're left to the idea that you're going to create a floating mesh network that's somehow going to move the data everywhere. But that obviously is going to take a long time to develop. So it's more likely that people are going to find a specific need. This band is going to meet their need, and they'll be willing, to foot the bill for the price. And maybe in the end, it's a government somewhere, a city that wants this capability through the city. They're promoting high tech, and they're going to do that. Other cases, it may be a company or college campus that wants to do it. It's just hard to understand how the wireless companies themselves will put an antenna on every light post and that sort of thing. So
yeah. I guess I could lead a bit. I guess if we want to finish up on a topic of looking at kind of the sharing of spectrum. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk nowadays about the wireless guys using various technologies to tap into unlicensed spectrum to enhance their own LTE deployments, whether LTE or whatever it's going to be. And I guess, that does seem to be kind of progressing to an extent. I know there's a lot of pushback from the Wi-Fi industry about that, but it seems like there's so much need, at least for relatively low band spectrum. I mean, could you see a possible future where, maybe the 2.4 and the 5 gig bands are at some point transitioned to a more licensed, unlicensed, shared model, and then in turn, those upper bands could then be unleashed for unlicensed use, basically for maybe companies that want to just have their own localized networks, and they could, instead of relying on 2.4 and 5, to then maybe tap a 70 or an 80 or a 60 gigahertz band and use that instead. Is that a possibility? I guess in terms of looking at shared, or am I way out on left base.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most of these new kind of competing technologies are still look very much like unlicensed type opportunities. Even with LTEU is understood to be an unlicensed scheme. Yeah. And so I think the unlicensed community is pretty well dug in these bands, and I don't think you'll see much interest in injecting a licensing regime in there. We will see, I think, based on the 3.5 gigahertz effort, whether licensing and unlicensed in the same band, works effectively, and we'll see how that gets controlled. So it's always great to have those test beds along the way to see does this work or doesn't it work. But whether having unlicensed possibilities in there will in fact decrease any interest in the licensed type community, certainly in paying money for the spectrum. They're already going to be secondary to the government, particularly military operating, and they'll be having to respond to those operations. So we'll see how that works. I mean, I think in the end, one of the critical components in these issues that keep coming up related to sharing is it seems like nobody wants to give. Nobody wants to come in with an answer, or they want to go off on their own and do measurements which essentially are done to prove their point. And I think ultimately you've got to have either a field where all the participants get invited in. I mean, right now we've had a couple of participants, satellite and wireless industry people in the Spectrum Frontiers world tried to come up with an answer, and of course the rest of them all said no, that doesn't work for us. So in the end, I think you've got to be able to pull in some people who can do the kind of the honest technical work and so on to try to resolve these things where there's an agreed test plan, there's an agreement on what the outcomes will mean. If they come out and say the answer is 1, that means yes, it was successful. The answer is 2, then it was no, it was unsuccessful, instead of arguing all that after the work is done. So I think there's still a place there for that, but of course everybody has to come to the point where they believe that they're better off coming to a resolved place than one where the answer is put upon them. I mean, recently, for instance, on the Global Star stuff, people couldn't come to a successful outcome. Then we started hearing that the outcome of the commission was going to be just to say, we couldn't resolve this, therefore we're going to let them do it and see what happens. And then, of course, we then started seeing some of the commissioners saying, well, they couldn't accept that outcome and so on. So I certainly would encourage everybody in industry to see if they can't get down and actually work on and negotiate outcomes that work for everybody. I mean, let's face it, we ought to be able to work out issues between the Wi-Fi industry and the auto industry that's using a Wi-Fi based concept. I mean, why can't we work that out? They're all in the same world. So hopefully they'll all come to see that, because dictated answers are going to make nobody happy.
That's a good point. Yeah, but like you said, though, I mean, people do want to feel like they're getting their, their say in the matter. And again, giving up spectrum was always such a tricky proposition. So if you've got some sort of access or control over a band of spectrum, no one ever wants to give that up. That's for sure. So getting people to work on those is always going to be, like I said, a bit of a challenge there.
Yeah, it's only the government actually that we can ever get to give up spectrum, right? It's really amazing as we look at the spectrum that the FCC has brought in under the National Broadband Plan. It's all essentially decisions where they've granted the existing licensees a better opportunity to use spectrum, or in the incentive auction where they're letting people work it out financially. Government, we don't deal that way. We basically say, you get out of that spectrum, we'll figure out some way to help you go somewhere else. And that's kind of the bottom line. So I think we still need a lot of work on incentives for the government. Hopefully we'll come up with real answers there. So
Yeah, makes sense. Hey, Carl, definitely appreciate the good insight on this. Obviously, a lot happening in terms of the spectrum world. I mean, it always seems like, whenever one solution or one problem gets solved, something else pops up somewhere else. And it seems like there's this never-ending areas for debate and discussion. So it's always good to talk to you about that and get some insight on that. So we definitely appreciate
the. Just have to keep in mind, it's a career. It's not a vacation or a weekend. It's a career. So.
That's true. That is true. It is definitely a long time goal to kind of work on these things. But hey, Carl, again, thanks so much for the time and insight today. Thanks so much. Hopefully we'll touch base again soon. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check us out again next week when we speak with Sprint COO of Technology, Gunther Offendorfer, on the carrier's 5G moves.